On a humid morning on the island of Barbados, a boy no older than 12 feeds cane stalks into a set of iron rollers. He has done this since before dawn, and his eyes are closing. And when his sleeve catches, the rollers take his hand, then his arm, and the overseer standing beside the mill does not reach for the boy. He reaches for the machete kept there for exactly this reason, because it is faster and cheaper to take the arm than to stop the mill. That machete hung beside every sugar mill in the Caribbean for a reason. Stopping the rollers meant stopping the sugar, and stopping the sugar meant losing money. And on those islands, a human being was worth less than the sweetness he was crushing. The boy at the mill is not a symbol. He was one of millions. And the thing his arm was crushing that morning is sitting in your kitchen right now, in a bowl, in a bag, stirred without a thought into your coffee. We think of sugar as innocent, the first taste we give a baby, the reward at the hard day. The white powder so ordinary we measure it in nothing, sprinkle it over everything, and never once ask where it came from or what it cost. It costs more than almost anything else humans have ever consumed. But the story of sugar does not begin on those blood-soaked islands. It begins thousands of years earlier, on the other side of the world, in the swamps of a tropical island where a tall grass grew wild, and where the people who first bit into it had no idea they were tasting something that would one day be worth more than gold, and paid for in more blood than gold ever was. That island was New Guinea. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the people there found a thick, fibrous grass, snapped it, and chewed the pith, and a sweetness flooded their mouths unlike anything in their world. No honey, no fruit, nothing came close. They didn't have the word for sucrose. They didn't know they were tasting concentrated solar energy stored in a plant's stalk. But they knew they wanted more, and they began to cultivate it, passing cuttings from village to village, hand to hand, across the islands of the Pacific. This is where sugar was born, not in a factory, not in a plantation, in the hands of Pacific Islanders who domesticated a wild grass and treated it as a garden plant, a sweet treat, a thing you chewed at a feast. For thousands of years, that is all sugar was, a luxury of the mouth, harmless, local, slow. And here's the first thing that should surprise you. For most of human history, sugar, as we know it, the white crystal, did not exist at all. What existed was cane you chewed. Turning that watery green juice into a stable, storable, transportable crystal was one of the great chemical achievements of the ancient world, and it did not happen in Europe. Europe was nowhere near this story for a very long time. The breakthrough happened in India. Somewhere around 2,500 years ago, in the north of the Indian subcontinent, people learned to boil the cane juice, reduce it, and let it crystallize into grainy brown lumps. They called it in Sanskrit sharkara, meaning gravel or ground grit, because that is what the crystals look like. From that single word came the Arabic sukar, the Latin sucarum, the French sucre, the English sugar. Every time you say the word, you are speaking a fragment of ancient Sanskrit, describing a handful of gravel. When the armies of Alexander the Great pushed into India, one of his commanders reported back something astonishing. He described a reed that produced honey without any bees. Think about what that meant to a Greek. Sweetness, to the entire ancient Mediterranean world, meant honey, and honey meant bees, and bees meant a limited, dangerous, seasonal harvest. And here was a plant that made honey with no bees at all, endlessly, from a stalk. It sounded like a traveler's lie. It was completely true. But the reversal is even stranger than that. In the ancient and medieval world, sugar was not food. It was medicine. When sugar first trickled westward through Persia and the Arab world, it entered the pharmacy, not the kitchen. Physicians ground it into powders, mixed it into syrups, prescribed it for fevers and coughs and disorders of the stomach. It was rare, it was expensive, and it was kept behind the counter of the apothecary, doled out by the grain. The phrase we still use, "a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down," is a faint memory of a time when sugar was the medicine. It was locked away, precious, a substance of the elite and the sick. It was the Arab world that transformed sugar from a curiosity into an industry. As Islamic civilization spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, It carried the sugarcane with it, and it carried something more important, the engineering to process it at scale. Arab agronomists mastered irrigation to feed the thirsty cane. They refined the boiling and crystallizing until they could produce white sugar, clarified and purified, a thing of astonishing beauty. They built the first true sugar refineries the world had seen. There is a saying that sugar followed the Quran. Wherever Islam went, the cane and the mills went with it. And this is the part of the story that too often gets erased. The knowledge that would one day fuel the plantations of the Americas, how to grow cane, how to press it, how to boil and clarify and crystallize it. That was not a European invention. Europeans inherited it wholesale from the Arab world. That is their achievement, their science, their inheritance. It belongs to them, and it deserves to be named as theirs. Because when the Crusaders came marching into the Holy Land with swords and God on their lips, they found something they had never tasted. In the lands they conquered around the eastern Mediterranean, they found fields of cane and mills producing this sweet white crystal. And they were, quite simply, addicted on contact. They called it sweet salt. They had no framework for it. And when they went home, they wanted it. They wanted it desperately. That craving was the spark. A rich European market suddenly hungering for a substance almost none of them could grow in their cold northern climates. Sugarcane needs heat, water, and endless human labor. It will not grow in France or England or Germany. It grows in the tropics. And so the story of sugar becomes the story of Europe reaching south and west, hunting for places hot enough to grow it, and for people to force into growing it. But first, the establishment had to decide what to make of this strange new pleasure, and the church was not sure it approved. Here's where sugar collided with something bigger than taste. It collided with sin. Medieval Christianity was deeply suspicious of pleasure for its own sake, and few pleasures were as pure, as bodily, as instantly gratifying as sweetness. Theologians tied themselves in knots over it. During Lent and the many fasting days of the Christian calendar, the faithful were forbidden rich foods. But was sugar a food, or was it a medicine? Because if it was medicine, you could take it during a fast. And the clergy, who loved sugar as much as anyone, conveniently decided again and again that it was medicinal. You could eat your sugar delicacies on a fast day and call it health. It was a loophole dressed up as theology, and the wealthy drove a carriage straight through it. Sugar became a marker of status so absolute, it bordered on the absurd. At grand banquets, the mega-rich commissioned entire sculptures made of sugar, called subtleties, enormous molded figures of castles, saints, animals, ships, kings on horseback, all built from sugar paste and set on the table. Some were the size of a small child. And here's the point. They were not really meant to be eaten. They were meant to be seen. To display a sugar sculpture was to announce that you were so rich you could take a substance worth its weight in silver and simply mold it into art and let it sit there, melting, for the admiration of your guests. Queen Elizabeth I of England was famously fond of sugar, so fond that her teeth reportedly turned black with decay, and this rotting of the royal mouth became, incredibly, a fashion. Court ladies who could not afford enough sugar to rot their own teeth are said to have blackened them deliberately, to imitate the queen, to look as though they too could afford the disease of the rich. Think about that for a second. A status symbol so powerful that people faked the tooth decay. So sugar was rare, it was medicinal, it was a plaything of kings and a puzzle for priests. The thing standing between Europe and an ocean of it was simple: geography. You could not grow enough cane in the Mediterranean to satisfy a continent. You needed vast new lands, tropical and hot, and you needed an unimaginable amount of labor to work them. The clock was already ticking toward catastrophe. Europe just hadn't found the fields yet. Then, in the 15th century, they found them. The Portuguese and the Spanish began pushing out into the Atlantic, colonizing islands off the coast of Africa: Madeira, the Canaries, Sao Tomé. These islands were warm, wet, volcanic, and empty of the people who could resist, and they were perfect for cane. On Madeira, the Portuguese planted sugar and it exploded. Within a few decades, a single island was flooding Europe with sugar, and the price began, for the first time, to fall. But cane is merciless. It devours labor. Someone has to plant it, weed it, cut it in the killing heat, haul it, feed it into the mills, and tend the boiling houses where the air is thick enough to choke you. Free people would not do this work. So the planters looked at the coast of Africa, so close across the water, and they made a choice. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. On the island of São Tomé, off the coast of Central Africa, the Portuguese assembled the template, the blueprint, for everything that was coming. A tropical island, a single crop, and an enslaved African workforce, transported across the water in chains, worked until they died, and replaced with more. São Tomé became the first true slave plantation sugar economy in history. It was the prototype. And when Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, he carried sugarcane cuttings with him on his second voyage, because his own father-in-law had been a sugar planter on Madeira, and Columbus knew exactly what this plant was worth. He was looking for gold and a route to Asia. He walked right past the real treasure. It was in the cuttings in his own hold. The cane took to the New World like fire to dry grass. The Caribbean and the coast of Brazil turned out to be the finest sugar-growing land on earth, endless, hot, and wet. And so began the single largest forced migration in human history, an engine of death that ran for nearly 400 years, all to satisfy Europe's sweet tooth. Let me give you the number, because the number is the story. Across the entire span of the transatlantic slave trade, historians estimate that around 12.5 million African men, women, and children were loaded onto ships and carried across the ocean. 12.5 million. And of all of them, the largest single share, more than any other destination, more than the future United States by many times over, were sent to the sugar colonies. The sugar islands of the Caribbean and the sugar coast of Brazil consumed human beings faster than anywhere else on Earth. This is the part that should make you angry, because the reason the sugar colonies swallowed so many is grotesque in its logic. On the plantations of Barbados and Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, enslaved people died faster than they could reproduce. The work was so brutal, the heat so punishing, the machinery so lethal, the tropical disease so rampant, that the average enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation lived only a few years after arrival. A few years. And the planters had done the arithmetic. They had decided coldly, on paper, that it was cheaper to work a human being to death and buy a replacement than to keep him alive. Feeding people well, easing the labor, letting them rest and raise families, all of that cost money. Buying a fresh body off a ship was cheaper, so they chose death over and over, deliberately, as a business model. Picture the boiling house at midnight. The mill runs day and night during harvest, because once the cane is cut, it must be crushed within hours, or the sugar spoils. Inside, the air is a wet furnace. A row of great copper kettles sits over roaring fires, the juice boiling from one to the next, thickening, darkening. An enslaved woman stands beside the last and hottest kettle with a long ladle, skimming, testing, judging the exact moment the syrup is ready to strike. A skill that took years to learn. Performed while half fainting from heat. For 18 hours at a stretch. If she falls asleep on her feet and slips, the molten sugar takes her. It clings to skin. It does not let go. The overseers called the burns it left the branding of the sugar. She has no name in any ledger I can show you. There were tens of thousands of her. Sit with that for a moment. Every spoonful of white sugar that sweetened a cup of tea in a comfortable London parlor passed, at some point, through hands like hers. The elegance of the tea table and the horror of the boiling house were the same system. One could not exist without the other. And now we come to the men who ran it, and the words they left behind. The sugar planters were not shadowy figures acting in secret. They were respectable men. They sat in parliaments. They funded churches and universities. They wrote down what they did, plainly, because they did not believe they were doing anything wrong. A man named Edward Long, a Jamaican plantation owner and one of the most powerful voices of the sugar interest, sat down in the 1770s and wrote a long, admired history of Jamaica, in which he argued in cold and careful prose that Africans were a separate and inferior order of being, closer to animals than to Europeans. He wrote those words not as a private confession, but as published philosophy, meant to be read and praised by gentlemen. He built an entire intellectual scaffolding of racism for one reason: to justify the machine that made him rich. The blight of racial slavery was many things, but at its root, on those islands, it was an accounting decision, dressed up in the language of science. And the profits were beyond imagining. The tiny island of Barbados, an island you could drive across in an afternoon, smaller than many American cities, became for a time the single richest colony in the entire English-speaking world. Not because of its size, because of sugar. A pamphleteer of the age wrote that the sugar islands were worth more to the crown than all the vast forests and farms of North America combined. Britain fought wars over specks of land in the Caribbean. In one peace negotiation, France was given the choice between keeping the enormous territory of Canada or keeping the single small sugar island of Guadeloupe. And it was a genuine debate, because the island's sugar was thought to be worth more than a continent of snow. Think about that. A country weighed all of Canada against one island of cane and had to stop and think. The wealth flooded back into Europe and built the world we recognize. It built the docks of Liverpool and Bristol and Nantes. It built country estates and stately homes whose owners never once set foot on a plantation. The money washed clean as it traveled, and by the time it became a bank, a railway, an insurance house, no one could smell the boiling house on it anymore. Some of the largest financial institutions on earth today can trace a thread of their founding capital straight back to the sugar and the people who were destroyed to produce it. The sweetness laundered itself into respectability, but you cannot work millions of people to death and expect them to accept it forever. And on one island, they did not. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the richest single colony on the face of the planet, a place that alone produced more sugar than all the British islands combined, the enslaved rose up. In 1791, 500,000 enslaved people launched the largest and most successful slave revolt in human history. They burned the plantations. They burned the cane fields until the sky over the island glowed. And against the armies of France, of Spain, of Britain, against Napoleon himself, who sent tens of thousands of troops to crush them, they won. They defeated the greatest military power in Europe and founded a new nation, Haiti, the first country in the world created by former slaves who had freed themselves. That victory is theirs. It belongs to the people who won it, and no telling of sugar's story is honest without it. France never forgave them. And here's the final cruelty, the one that still shapes the world today. In exchange for recognizing Haiti's independence, France demanded that Haiti pay it a colossal sum of money. Compensation, not for the enslaved people, but to the former slave owners for the loss of their property. The people who had been the property were ordered to pay for having freed themselves. Haiti, terrified of a French invasion, agreed. And it spent well over a century paying that debt, draining its treasury, borrowing at ruinous interest from French banks, impoverishing itself for generations to buy the freedom it had already taken with its own blood. Much of the poverty that shadows Haiti to this day flows directly from that ransom. The revolt was won on the battlefield. It was punished at the negotiating table for 120 years. The natural thing, the sweetness of a plant, was not the crime. The scale of the suffering was a series of human choices, made by named men, written down in ledgers, defended in parliaments, and enforced at the point of a gun. Slavery in the sugar colonies was eventually abolished, colony by colony, through the 1800s, and even that came with a final insult. When Britain freed the enslaved people in its empire, it paid compensation, but it paid the money to the slave owners for their lost property, not a penny to the people who had been enslaved. That compensation was so large that the British government took out a loan to fund it, a loan so enormous that British taxpayers did not finish paying it off until the year 2015. Let that land. If you were an adult in Britain a decade ago, part of your taxes was still, at that very moment, paying off the debt incurred to compensate slave owners for the loss of human beings. The past is not nearly as far away as we like to pretend. So, what happened to sugar after the blood dried? It did what it always does. It got cheaper, and it got everywhere. In the 19th century, chemists learned to extract sugar from a humble, cold climate root, the sugar beet, breaking the tropical monopoly and flooding the world with a supply that no longer required a Caribbean island. Sugar stopped being a luxury of kings and became the cheapest source of calories on Earth. And that is when it stopped killing people on plantations and quietly started killing them at the dinner table. Here are the numbers that should stop you cold. The average American today consumes somewhere around 60 pounds of added sugar every single year. 60 pounds. That is a sack of sugar the size of a small child, eaten by each person every year, most of it invisible, hidden in bread and sauces and salad dressing and yogurt, and things that do not even taste sweet. In the medieval world, sugar was so precious it was weighed against silver and locked in the apothecary's cabinet. Today it is so cheap and so abundant that the modern struggle is not to get enough of it, but to escape it. And the industry has not entirely lost the old habit of deception. In the 1960s, the sugar industry in the United States secretly funded scientists to downplay the link between sugar and heart disease, and to point the finger at dietary fat instead. Documents uncovered decades later revealed that a sugar trade group paid researchers, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars, to produce a review published in a prestigious medical journal that steered blame away from sugar. For decades, public health advice pushed people away from fat and toward carbohydrates and sugar, and a generation was shaped by science that had, quietly, been bought. The boiling house had become a laboratory, but the instinct to protect the profit at any cost had not changed at all. Sugar has been to war. It was rationed as a strategic resource in both world wars. Its byproduct, molasses, was fermented into the rum that fueled navies and lubricated the very slave trade that produced it, a closed and horrible loop. Sugar-derived ethanol runs millions of cars in Brazil today, and that same sweet crystal, refined and purified, has flown into orbit aboard spacecraft, because sugar is a nearly perfect way to store and transport energy, which is, when you think about it, exactly what those first islanders discovered 10,000 years ago when they snapped a stalk of grass and tasted the sun stored inside it. Which brings us back to the mill and the boy and the machete. He fed cane into those rollers because a continent and ocean away had decided it could not live without a sweetness it had only tasted a few centuries before. His arm, the woman at the boiling kettle, the 12.5 million carried across the water, the burned cane fields of Haiti, the debt paid until 2015. All of it is dissolved, invisible, and complete in the white powder you will stir into your coffee tomorrow morning without a second thought. Think about that boy the next time you reach for the bowl. His name is gone. The thing he was crushing is on your table. And the distance between his hand and the rollers and the sweetness on your tongue is smaller than anyone ever wanted you to know. You will never look at a spoonful of sugar the same way again. So tell me in the comments which one stayed with you the most. The country that had to choose between all of Canada and one small island of cane? The sugar industry secretly paying scientists in the 1960s to blame fat instead? Or the British taxpayers, who were still paying off the slave owner compensation loan in the year 2015? Drop it below. I read them all. And if this changed the way you see the thing in your kitchen, subscribe, because next time we're taking apart another ordinary object you'll wish you'd never learned the truth about.